Welcome back to another episode of Napp Motorsports, and today I'm going to show you how to VVT swap your 1.6 Miata. This applies specifically to 1.6s, but if you are VVT swapping your NA8, so 94 to 97 Miata, a lot of things will be similar. So don't shut the video off just because you think it doesn't apply to you. It will apply. It'll at least help you, point you in the right direction. But biggest thing is 1.8 swapping a 1.6 Miata. So let's get into the benefits before we actually start anything. So we all know the 1.6 is literally the worst engine ever made. It's slow, it's underpowered, it's not rev happy, it's just a bad motor. So pretty commonly, people tend to 1.8 swap it. It can be either a NA8, which is fairly plug and play, a NB1, so a BP4W 99 to 2000 head, or best motor ever, a VVT from a 01 to 05 Miata. Benefits of a 1.8 in general: if you haven't seen my other video where I compare all the engines, I go over it pretty in detail there. Higher displacement, better head flow on the NBs, and just overall more power. With the VVT, like what we're going to be putting into this BRG here, you get lower end torque because of the variable valve timing, and you can't make it up with cams. So like cams move your power band once, VVT allows you to move your power band continuously. So if you're like, oh, I'll just put cams to help my low end, you'll lose top end. So on a VVT, you can gain low end without losing top end. So the dyno number between a BP4W and a VVT, the peak number will probably be the same, but the area under the curve will be greater on a VVT. So that's why I love these things. They kind of get out faster out of a corner, and they're just better motors, and they're not that complicated. So a lot of people are afraid of the wiring aspect of doing this, so that's what I'm going to walk you guys through today, as well as fuel and all sorts of other stuff that we have to do. But in the end, it is pretty simple, and there are 1,000 ways to skin a cat. You can do this a ton of different ways. I'm going to show you how I do it and how I have done it on every other car that I have VVT swapped. It seems to be the simplest and just easiest method. There's nothing crazy involved. It is a little more expensive than there's like cheaper ways to do this, but this is how I do it. Least headache, easiest, and just most reliable setup. So before we actually get to installing the 1.8, there are things we have to remove from the 1.6 to carry over to the 1.8. So I'm going to talk you guys through that kind of stuff now. I have the engine out of the car currently. I'll hopefully put it in tomorrow, but it'll give you an opportunity to walk around it and point out kind of where the sensors go, what sensors you want to keep, and what you need to carry over from one to the other. So this is Corey's car. Shout out Corey. I'll put his Instagram handle here. This is a VVT block, like I was saying, 01 to 05. This is turbo. It's not really going to affect what I'm talking about today. I have some extra wiring to do because of it, but it does not change the overall scheme of what needs to be done here. So we'll start with fuel, just because it's the most generic. Easiest way to do fuel on one of these cars is with Radium's kit. So fuel pressure regulator, direct mount through the top port here with a gauge. You have your fuel feed from the chassis, and this would be your fuel return. You can do some combination of 94 to 97 fuel rail with a different fuel pressure regulator. That's one way to do it. This is the easy way to do it. So this takes regular injectors. We've obviously got some bigger IDs in here, but you can use your OEM NB injectors if you're keeping it NA, and then just slap them in the rail with some new O-rings and lube, and then you're good to go. So radium fuel rail and radium fuel pressure regulator, easiest way to do the fuel system. And you don't really have to do any changes to the car. I've added a Deechworks fuel pump, but the NA fuel pump will run it if it is an NA motor, or like naturally aspirated non-turbo setup. So fuel in, fuel out, radium fuel rail, done. And I will put the part number here for the fuel rail, fuel pressure regulator, and fuel gauge, fuel pressure gauge. On the topic of fuel, if you have a 90 to 93, they are factory wired batch fire, or batch spray, I guess. So cylinders 1 and 4 both shoot fuel at the same time, and then cylinders 2 and 3 shoot fuel at the same time. It's fine factory, but when you start putting bigger injectors in it, you start having issues at idle because you can only pump so little fuel in at a time. So while you have it out, I'm going to suggest wiring it for sequential fuel. So what we're going to do is take the 1.6 injection harness. So you've got your injector plugs 1, 2, 3, 4. That single wire is the temperature probe, and that dual pin is the ECU temperature. And this side is what plugs into the chassis. So we're pretty much going to scrap this whole thing, minus a couple plugs, because the new injectors came with a wiring harness, sort of, or came with flying leads. So we're going to splice these in, and I'm going to show you how to do all the wiring for that. It's very simple, but if you haven't done it before, it is a little confusing at first. So next very important thing is the alternator. This is an NA8, so 94 to 97 alternator. You cannot use the 1.6 alternator because it's a V-band, or not a V-band, because it is a V-style belt, and then the 1.8s use a ribbed belt. So 94 to 97, and you can't use a 99 to 2005 because they don't have internal regulation on the voltage, and the ECU can't regulate it. So you would send like 16 volts back to your ECU and you can do a bunch of damage. So 94 to 97, bolts right up, super easy. There's no wiring changes, like the plug is the same. We will have to do a change on the stud, but that's super easy. So that covers the alternator. It's very much plug and play, like almost. And then for your other accessories, he has a power steering delete kit because he doesn't run power steering, or he's gonna run electric power steering. If you are running power steering and air conditioning, the brackets and the pumps are the same between 90 to 2005. So what I recommend doing when you pull your 1.6 out and throw it in the garbage, leave your AC hooked up, and then you just take these 4 bolts out, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Slides off the side. You can do it all when it's in the car. Slides off the side, and you can leave it hanging. You don't have to discharge the lines or anything like that. And then the bracket, which I have to install on his car, just bolts up down here on the engine block, and when you throw the engine back in, you bolt the block back up. For power steering, I recommend the same thing. So you would just remove the pump, set it off to the side, take the motor out, and then remove the bracket when it's out of the car, slam it onto the next engine, put it back in, and then you can reuse the power steering and air conditioning. So those accessories are the same, the belts are the same. It's as easy as that on this side. So next up, we're going to go over the sensors that you want to take from the 1.6. So on the back of the block, there are 2 coolant temperature sensors. There's this one, which I think on some years is a green plug, but it's a 2-pin plug. That is your ECU coolant temp. And then, kind of tough to see it, the single spade connector that lives, it typically sits on the coolant plate on the back. That is your dashboard temperature. So if you want your dashboard to read, that's the plug you need. And there's actually a spot for it on the VVT blocks, or on any block really, right there in the head casting. There's just a set screw in there. Just take the set screw out, thread that in with some thread tape, and now you have your engine coolant temp sensor on your dashboard. Oil pressure is going to be next. 90 to 94 has a real oil pressure signal, which is what you want. It's this guy. Typically lives down here on the side of the block, where I have, you can see I have this supply feed line here. If you are keeping your car NA, I highly recommend just threading this into the bottom port, so there's like the VVT supply rail. Just thread this in there, and then your stock wiring harness will reach. And then you have real oil pressure, and that's just the VVT supply pipe that runs up to here and supplies oil pressure to VVT. So there is a provision for it. It's if you have a VVT block, there's like a single spade little connector on there. That's the dummy gauge. Just remove it and then swap this guy in, and you're good to go. The reason I'm not doing it, so if you see this line here, this is feeding off the original spot on the block. This is an advanced Autosports distribution block, so this feeds to a block that I'm going to mount up on the firewall or the fuse box, and this is feed. And then the block has 3 ports, so one of them is going to be digital oil pressure to the dashboard, or to the ECU. You have the real oil pressure, so I'll thread that guy into it. And then on the bottom, I'm going to have the turbo feed, which is going to run around the engine bay into the turbo. So if you don't have those kind of things, just plug it into the block. If you want to boost it or you want to run external sensors, I highly recommend this kit. It's made for Miatas, so the thread is right for the block, and it has everything you need. So that's why I've got this, and I'll show you when the car is in, or I'll show you when the engine is in, why I use this. It's just super simple. There are a few sensors from the NB that we want to keep that we're going to wire into the chassis. It's a little more advanced than the NA, so there's like, you know, nicer features and things like that, better control for the ECU. Among those, we've got the crank position sensor. This is just an OEM style unit, just bolts up 1 credit card's width between the crank position sensor and the pulley. So there's like little teeth on the pulley. Credit card or 40 thousandths or 1 millimeter is good. This is a Boffy Racing 36.2 trigger wheel, so I highly recommend it. It gives you better resolution for tuning. And then also we have the camshaft position sensor. So this is just OEM again, bolts in factory style. And then we will run a plug out of there to the OEM harness, and I'll show you guys how to do all that. Next up, we have idle air control. So this is an NB idle air control valve. This is a 64mm eBay throttle body. Honestly, better than Skunk 2. And if you buy it if you're doing a VVT swap, I highly recommend, or a BP4W swap, or really any swap, honestly, getting the 99 to 2005 compatible throttle body, because the throttle bodies are the same from 94 to 05, but what's different is this adapter plate on the bottom, which allows you to run this idle air control valve. So on an NA8 or an NA6, there's a hose that comes out of here that runs up to the intake, and that's how it meters your idle air. On the newer NB style, you have a bleed port here, and that's where you get your air from. So no hoses, no nothing, just 2 wires into it. It's way cleaner. If you're building intercooler piping, an intake, anything like that, not having to worry about that hose is a game changer. So you can get these off Rock Auto, IACV or idle air control valve. They're like 120 bucks. Or if your engine came with everything, you can just harvest it off of that. So NB idle air control valve. And then I am going to use the NB throttle position sensor. You can use a BMW TPS, there's a Kia TPS, you can do the automatic 1.6 TPS. I just find it easiest. NB throttle body with an NB throttle position sensor, bolts right up like factory. It's not like sticking way out or anything like that. And then we will just wire this into the factory harness. Again, super easy. And then you'll have variable TPS in the Mega Squirt. There's no screwing around with anything, so highly recommend that. And lastly, we have VVT itself. So this solenoid here, this black thing, is your VVT actuator. This is kind of what allows the oil pressure in and out to your VVT gear in here. 2 wires, one is positive and one is ECU signal. I'll show you guys how we wire that up and wire that back to the firewall and all that stuff. Again, super easy. This is what gets you that mid-range torque that the VVT is all about. Don't be afraid of this. I will cover how to wire it later in the episode. I'm just kind of doing a brief overview. Almost forgot to mention the coil packs. So we're going to wire this car as if it was an NB. That way these coil packs are super easy to wire in. You can buy Flow Force's kit that makes it very plug and play. That's what I would recommend if you're not like big into wiring. So Flow Force R8 coils. I'm going to build this wiring harness, but it's the same as the one Flow Force uses. So if you're going to watch it with a Flow Force kit, it's going to be the same process. There is some work we have to do in the engine bay to accept it, but we'll delete the igniter and all sorts of stuff like that to make it super nice and easy plug and play kit. Clutch and flywheel, you have a lot of options. It's pretty simple. This is a Boffy Racing pressure plate and clutch, and then a competition, I believe it's a 10-pound flywheel or something like that. Doesn't matter what Miata you have, NA or MB, clutches and flywheels are interchangeable. You just have to match the clutch to the flywheel. So you can put a 1.8 clutch and a 1.8 flywheel in a 1.6. You can put a 1.6 clutch and a 1.6 flywheel into a 1.8. You cannot put a 1.8 clutch with a 1.6 flywheel. The sizes are different, but they do all bolt up to the block the same. So what I recommend, if you're not going for crazy power, 1.6 clutch and a 1.6 flywheel, because then you have less rotating mass since they're smaller, and it'll rev it up a little faster and all sorts of stuff like that. So this is Boffy Racing's clutch. It's a hybrid, I believe, like one side is 6-puck, one side is full face. On the street, it feels very OEM. So if you don't want to do leg day every time you drive your car, which you really don't want to, I don't like driving a race car on the street is not cool. So if you don't want a hard clutch, I highly recommend the Boffy clutch. I'll put a link to it down below. I'll put a link to the parts down below. I'm probably going to list them on my site, and then if you want, you can order them from me or whatever. Lastly, I think, is going to be the engine mounts. I don't have them on the block right now because this wheelie engine stand takes it away from me, or takes the ability to bolt them up away from me. So when we go to load it in the car, I will show you guys the engine mounts. I'm running and always run AWR engine mounts. This one is getting their new adjustable setup just so I can clear the turbo. But the cheat code for engine mounts is to just match the engine mount to the year of the engine, not the chassis. So the VVTs have a little different leg on the bottom that I'll show you later. You can run earlier year engine mounts on these cars. I believe any 1.8 one will fit, but if you're buying them, just buy the 1.8 ones and they'll bolt right up. But again, we'll cover that when it's all assembled and ready to go in the car. If you're watching all this and you're like, Stefan, you're going way too fast, hang on, relax. I'm gonna go over absolutely everything as I do it because I have to wire this car up. So I'm gonna take you along with me and I'll point it all out. I'll show you which wire goes where, and it will be nice and straightforward, hopefully. So let's get into rebuilding the injector harness for sequential fuel. I want to do that out of the car so I can just like work around the engine and plug it in, and then we'll move on to stuff in the chassis. All right, let's start with the injector harness because this is probably the most complicated part of the whole thing, but it also lets us wire in VVT control. So kind of important. What we're going to do here is, first of all, strip this entire harness back so it's just wire. We're not going to use anything but these two. But if you're going to do this without doing what I'm about to do, I'll still walk you through how to do that. So, and then I'm going to end up converting this to a Deutsch connector. But you can keep this plug and you can run 2 extra wires or 3 extra wires or whatever to a second plug that you can just get on Amazon. And then you can run that to the body. But I'm going to show you how I do it, and this feels like the most proper way to do it. And for starters, let's just strip this harness back. So I have stripped the harness apart, mainly just to explain what's going on and why we're doing this. This is overkill if you just want to swap it yourself, but this is how I do it, so just follow along. This black wire, single wire, goes right to the plug. This is your coolant temperature to the dashboard. This black with green and blue with white wire to a green plug is your 2-pin coolant temperature sensor. It goes straight to the plug for your ECU. And then you have injectors 4, 3, 2, and 1. And they are what's called batch fire. So you can see your white wire. Each one has a white wire with red stripe. That's your power. And they're all the same, so it's all shared. It all comes into this little terminal right here. So they all share the same power. There's no issue there. The issue stems that they share a trigger. So injectors 1 and 3 are yellow only. No stripe, no nothing. Cylinders, or injectors 2 and 4 both share yellow with a black stripe. So these two are bonded and these two are bonded. And you don't have control over individual cylinder injection. So what we're going to do is we're going to remove that from the situation, and we're going to make each one have its own signal wire from the ECU. if you're doing this without wiring in new plugs or anything like that, it's super easy. So cylinders 1 and 2, you don't touch. Cylinders 3 and 4, you would cut the yellow wire and cut the yellow and black wire. This yellow wire now has to run back to the ECU, and this yellow and black wire has to run back to the ECU. So you'd crimp on an extension harness, ideally to another plug, so that you can unplug it and remove it from the car if you ever wanted to. And then those two will run to pins on the ECU that can control cylinders 3 and 4 injection, which I will get to that when we get to wiring in the ECU. I'm going to show you how I do this. And the other thing we have to do is add the VVT plug. This one is obviously not pinned yet. I'm going to crimp it with some wires. The way this works, and it doesn't matter which plug hole you use, one of them is power and one of them runs to the ECU. So what you can do is take power from the injection harness, so the white wire with a red stripe, that will go into here, and then the other wire will run down the loom, and I'm going to plug it into the same Deechworks plug. But you can plug it into the plug you're going to use for injectors 3 and 4, and then that wire also runs back to the ECU. So what you have here is a 6 plug, and what you're going to end up with is a 9 plug. So I'm going to essentially start over. I'm going to use these 2 connectors and nothing else, and then I'll show you guys what it looks like when it's built. It's pretty hot right now because I just heat shrunk everything, and it looks absolutely a disaster. So what I'm going to do is take some of this Tesa tape. It's T-E-S-A, Tesa. It's like, it feels like what you'd wrap like a hockey stick in or something like that. And I'm going to section off pieces so that it holds its shape. So from messy spaghetti to this, it should be pretty clear at this point. So injectors 4, 3, 2, 1, VVT solenoid. This is the oil pressure or dashboard water temperature. This is the ECU water temperature, and it is all loomed in the way that it needs to sit in the car. The one thing I'm going to add to this, which is irrelevant to kind of doing this wiring swap, is a knock sensor. I've got 2 of them over there. So I'm going to just add a knock sensor loom, and it's going to spit out somewhere around here, just so that it can plug in right above the oil pressure. There's like a bung there, which is right in between cylinders 2 and 3. So I'm just going to add it in there so it's nice and clean. I believe it's only 2-pin. Yeah, so it's 2-pin, and I've got space on this Deutsch connector, so I might as well use it. I'll use pins 11 and 12 for the knock sensor, and then I'll loom it all up and I'll show you guys when it's all set. There you have it. I'm sure Daniel and Jesse are yelling at me. I didn't have shielded wire for the knock sensor. I did loom it up separately, so it is gapped separate, and it's just held on with a couple pieces of tape, and it's just 2 barrel pins into here. So worst case, if we have interference, I can remake this. I have spare connectors. I'll order some shielded wire just to have, and then I can remake it and run shielded wire back to the ECU. But for now, that'll do. This is now ready to put in the car, so I'm going to go lay it in. And I think I'm going to try and tuck it up from underneath the intake manifold to see if I can make that work. I'm waiting on a stud adapter to install this. Hopefully it's here tomorrow. I want to put that in before I put the engine in the car. But I'll run all the lines, I'll show you how it all plugs in, and then we'll move on to the R8 coil harness. I've just got to make one, but I'll just show you guys that. I'm not going to show you how it's done because I would just recommend buying one from Flowforce, but I will show you the harness all said and done once I've built it. Alright, so I didn't leave the tangs long enough to run it underneath the intake manifold, but I think it's okay because it also makes it serviceable. So if I have to take this out when it's in the car, if you've ever worked on one of these junk 2 manifolds, you know it's really hard to get underneath, which is why I want to put the knock sensor in before I put the motor in. But injectors 1 through 4 are plugged in, the harness is not tight, and then the VVT control is here, it's all plugged in. Coolant temp sensor, and then the other coolant temp sensor is back here. The harness has slack, it's not tight in any way, and then this will essentially be what we plug into the chassis, which means, I gotta find it. This 6-pin in the engine bay is the mating side of the injector harness. So obviously we can't use this anymore because we put a Deutsch connector on it. So what I'm going to do is peel this cabling back, or this electrical tape back, cut the plug off, pin on a Deutsch connector, and run just like long leads that are coiled up for all of the extra stuff we added. And then once we get to it, I will start running those through the firewall. All right, to confuse you guys even more, I have stripped the harness back. I cut the connector off, threw it in the garbage, and then pinned in, so you can see the wires that are curled up here. These are all the ones that we need to run to the ECU. But yellow is injector 1, and that is in slot 1. Yellow with black is injector 2, that is in slot 2. Purple is injector 3, that is in slot 3. Blue is injector 4, that's in slot 4. Power goes into slot 5. And if we flip it over, we have the 2 knock wires. So white is going to be knock signal plus to the ECU, which goes to the knock output. And then gray is going to go to sensor ground on the ECU. Green is our VVT. Blue with the white stripe is one of the 2 coolant sensor pins for the ECU coolant. Black with green is the other 2-pin connector wire for ECU coolant. And then black with blue over here on the end is the single spade connector. So good way to verify is you plug this in with the other end of the harness. Obviously this will all get loomed up and cleaned up. But you plug it in, you just like look across, like purple should go to purple, blue should go to blue. I took a picture of it before I loomed everything up as well, so I know that I'll know it all goes together correctly. But that's it for here. The next thing we're going to do is delete the igniter. So this is a must do if you're converting to the coil pack setup. So real quick, just to tee off for today, ignition harness is done. So this is R8 coils, and I've run it to 2 Deutsch connectors. The reason I didn't buy the Flow Force kit this time is because I'm doing Deutsch connectors on this car. So I would have had to de-pin theirs and repin it to this, which not the end of the world, but I have all the plug pieces to make them myself, so I just figured I would do it. So tomorrow, which will be immediate for you guys, but it's the end of the day here for me, we're going to do the igniter delete, and then we're going to convert the stock wiring harness to accept the new plug style. So we'll switch that over. We'll do the, we're going to wait for cam and crank signal until the engine is in the car because I want to run the line lengths and stuff like that. But I'm going to extend oil pressure. We're going to, so this is the alternator harness. This plug is the same. And on the NA8 harness, we have to, or on the NA8 alternator, the lug is bigger. So we're just going to cut this off and put a bigger terminal on it. That's all you got to do for the alternator stuff. And then I'm going to cut the wires for his trans and put Deutsch connectors on both of those. And then we'll go from there. So tomorrow I'll pick you up, we'll do igniter, and we'll work our way forward, and then we'll get to the point where the engine is ready to go into the car. It's the next day. I've done some kind of stuff that I had to do on the car that's not related to the VVT swap, so I did that off camera. But now it's time to do the igniter stuff, so we can wire in the coil pack setup, and then the engine will almost be ready to go in the car. There's one other thing I forgot to mention yesterday. So the throttle cable, this is 1/6 guys only. The throttle cable is too long, so like it comes out way too far. You need to swap in a 1.8 throttle cable. So I have one, I'll show you guys how to do it. You pop it out of the firewall, unhook it from the pedal. It's pretty straightforward. I'm gonna do it with the engine out once we do the igniter delete. But other than that, pretty straightforward. You can see for the 6-speed guys, I put Deutsch connectors on those pins. One is male, one is female, so you can't put them in the incorrect plug. So good tip on that one. All of these wires that we talked about earlier, they will have to go through the firewall at some point. So what I'm going to end up doing, because he already is running the map line through, I'm going to drill a hole there and put a grommet, and then we'll feed all the wires through that grommet for all the sensors we're going to run. I'm not going to run them through the firewall until we have all the wiring done with the engine in the car, because I want to loom it into one sheath and then throw it through the car. So just be cleaner that way. For now, we'll just keep the wires tucked up and out of the way. They're already run. We just need to finalize where they run to. So that'll be part of the ECU install. But yeah, so if you're wondering why they're all just chilling there, they will run through the firewall. So cool, let's get to the igniter. And it's pretty straightforward. So this is the igniter. And also, I haven't mentioned it yet. There's a thread on Miata Turbo. It's called the Definitive VVT Swap into a 1.6 chassis thread. If you just search VVT Swap Mega Thread, it will come up on Google. This has everything you need that I'm putting into a video. What I'm doing has some changes that I've just made over the years, but this is a lifeline. This is an absolutely super useful tool. So that's what I'm gonna go over this with you. I'm gonna reference this and we're gonna come back and forth. So there are 8 wires that come into this. 1 is going to be over here and 8 is going to be the red over here. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna unplug this. Just like that. And I'll flip it around. So now you have 1 on the right, 8 is the red on the left. So the thing to do now is to cut this connector off, but we're going to splice 1 into 2. We're going to delete 3, so the blue wire gets just like heat shrink capped. 4 and 5 get wired together, 6 gets capped, and then 7 and 8 get wired together. So that is essentially how we're going to remove this whole system, and then we're going to allow the ECU to do spark control and stuff like that. And the igniters are obviously on the coils now. So this is the cleanest way to do a coil on plug swap. So what I recommend, even if you're not doing a VVT swap or whatever, if you're getting the R8 coils and you have a 1.6, when you check out from Flowforce, my suggestion is to pick the VVT chassis, do this wiring. So like when I ask you what chassis you're putting it into, do this wiring, select VVT chassis, and then wire it in this way. It's the easiest way, and it's super clean. It gets rid of the nasty igniter on the side. So you have to have a standalone for that though, but you have to have a standalone for the R8 coils. But I guess let's get into it. Let's cut the plug off. I'll see if I can put you guys in a spot where you can watch, and then I'll show you before I loom it all together. All right, got it wired up. So black with the white stripe goes to yellow with the green stripe. White, solid white, goes to brown with the yellow stripe. Red, solid, goes to brown, solid. And then I know I said you can terminate the blue and the black. This is actually a unused switched 12 volt, and this is an unused ground. So what I did is ran it to a Deutsch connector, and we're gonna run oil pressure sensor, digital oil pressure and digital fuel pressure on this car. So I'm going to run the power and ground to those into here without having to run them through the engine bay. So little tip, you can run them out, you can just kind of leave them separate if you think you want to run anything, like if you need 12 volts for your boost controller, anything like that. It's good source right here, solid, strong source. So that's what this is for, that's why it's separate. I'll loom it up and we'll like tuck it kind of back up in here. And then this now I'm going to wrap with Testa tape, and then we'll tuck it up inside the chassis and you won't see it. I'm going to apologize in advance. I somehow hit the wrong button on this camera and it did like ×2 or 2x slow record speed, which had no audio. So I've done some things on the car that I'm going to catch you up on. The engine is in, but I looked back and I got to where we were, and I'm going to bring you guys back up to speed. So bear with me, I really apologize. So the engine is in, and where we just left off, we had done the delete for the igniter over here. And if I didn't mention it already, the blue and the black wire that they suggest you delete are actually 12 volts and ground. So I'm going to use them to power oil pressure and fuel pressure sensors. What you can do is use them to power your wideband. So if you're running a wideband in your car, which you should be if you're running a standalone, good tip is to run power and ground to here, all in the engine bay, and then for your signal wire to the ECU, cut off this single wire, single pin yellow connector, or yellow internal connector that's on like the chassis harness, And then that is your direct feed to the ECU. It's red with blue stripe, the wire. And then that takes a signal wire from the wideband. So your 5-volt wire, so your wire that is, I believe it is white on AEM units. Read your manual and be sure, don't plug it in wrong and blame me. So run that to here. So power ground, signal wire, and your wideband will be like routed. So if you're running a Beer Money Motorsports ECU, you don't have to bother, and you can just plug it into the ECU, which is pretty slick. I like to run gauges, so I will run them outside and just feed the signal into the ECU. So that's how I would do it. He had a wideband in this car already, so I got to see how he wired that in, but we'll probably keep it. But this is a good option. Next, we have the injector harness that we built that is all installed. It was on the motor when I installed it in the car. So we have our VVT plugged in, we have our coolant temp sensors plugged in on the back, both of them. And that feeds into this harness here that we built. So it's like all stock wires except for, well, so the wires that we're gonna need to worry about are purple, which is injector 3, blue, which is injector 4, and then on the back side, without kinking it too weird, the green wire that's hiding in there is our VVT signal. So you can see green is right there. So those are the wires that we're gonna need to run through the firewall to get to the ECU, which is in the passenger footwell on a 1.6 Miata. I have a lot of other wires because I'm running knock and things like that, so you can kind of ignore it. If you're running knock as well, then you can do the same thing. It's just a nice way to keep it all tidy. So what I've done is run that. I cut the factory plug off, and then I spliced in all of, I'll put all the wires back in. So yellow is injector 1, yellow with black is injector 2. Here, purple and blue, you can see are the new wires we added. If you look in the previous video, they're like coiled up, sitting. White with red is power, and then on the back side, gray and white are for my knock sensor. Yellow or green is VVT. Blue with white, black with green, and black with blue are all coolant temp sensors. So this harness has everything, and this goes back into the main body harness. And then I took the extra wires, or the new wires that we added, so the purple, blue, green, white, black for knock sensors. So purple, blue for injectors, green for VVT, and then white and gray for knock sensors. And I ran those separate out of the loom to another connector. And what I'm doing with that is this is an options port plug now. So you can see the wires there, purple, blue, green, gray, white, and then you'll see I have yellow and brown. Brown is my oil pressure sensor that I've got here, and then yellow is the fuel pressure sensor that's right here. So these are all the options pins that we're going to be putting into the ECU and running through the firewall. And then to future-proof it, on the chassis side, I ran 3 extra wires. So there's orange, red, and black, which I don't love using red and black for options, but whatever. I ran these so that I can terminate them in the footwell, but if he ever wants to do like flex fuel or anything like that, the wire's already fed through the firewall. He doesn't have to worry about it. He just has to put a pin in here, run that to the plug on the flex fuel sensor, and you're like ready to party. So that's why there's so many wires here. If you're doing just a basic VVT swap with sequential injection, which you should do anyways, you will need 3 wires, which would be VVT and then both injectors. And then what I did to get them into the firewall is I drilled a hole right here. It's like a 7/8 inch hole. Put a grommet on it, drilled the grommet out, and then I passed the wiring loom through it with some TIG rod, and or you can use a coat hanger, and I ran it down at an angle like this, which then clears it through. Ignore the MS Labs ECU because we're not going to be using that. Feeds it through into the footwell here, and this lives behind this metal plate into the footwell, and then so here's all the colors of the options port. Ignore all this stuff, we're going to cover that in the next episode, but that's how you get the wires into the chassis. Things that should be done while the engine is out of the car that I had filmed, but I totally screwed up my camera. Zoom me out. the main thing really is the lug for the alternator. Let's see if I can get eyes on it. Right there. The NB alternator, or sorry, the NA8 alternator has a bigger diameter. I believe it's like an 8mm lug, or it's an M8 lug instead of an M6 lug on the 1.6 ones. So the ring terminal will not fit over the connector. So all you do is you cut the white wire. It's like typically faded white. Cut the wire, crimp on a bigger ring terminal, and you're ready to go. Alternator plugs in as normal. Starter plugs in as normal. Both the spade and the stud, everything plugs in just fine. Pro tip, NB starter is smaller and it fits better with these junk 2 intake manifolds. It's also lighter if you're going for that kind of thing. Plugs in all the same, functions all the same. Worthwhile upgrade if you're ever replacing your starter. And then up next we've got grounds. So there's 2 ground wires on this harness here that I'm going to run to a stud on the intake manifold, as well as the ground wire that we added for the coil harness. So if you're running RA coils, you have to do the same thing, just ground this somewhere on the block. We also have the ground over here. This is very important. This has to ground really anywhere on the block. A good spot is the down there. You can see the little bracket that holds the dipstick in. There's a 10mm nut on the other side. You can put the ground on there and it's nice and hidden out of the way, away from some heat. So those are the grounds. And the other thing I did while the chassis was out, or while the engine was out, is I replaced the throttle cable. So you have to use an NA8 or maybe an NB, but at least an NA8 throttle cable. It's shorter, so you get the actual correct fitment. It pops out of the firewall pretty easy. It's right here. You stick a screwdriver behind it and pop, and it'll pop out. You'll probably break the clips, which is fine because you don't need it anymore. And then on the pedal, there's this little yellow clip on top. Just reach your hand around the back, push one side of the clip in and pull, and then the wire will come out the top. And then the new wire just feeds in, clips into the wall, and then you just push the yellow pin back into the pedal. It takes all of 5 minutes. It's very simple. If you're confused, I suggest just taking a look at it, and it'll make 1,000 times more sense. The last wire that you might have to run through the firewall, I should have mentioned this earlier, but I'm going to show you guys a hack so you don't have to do that, is intake air temp. So he already has his run because this car was already turbo when it came to me. But what I'm going to recommend, so intake air temp sensors typically go as close to the throttle body as possible. A lot of people tuck them, like I'm going to put his right back here. So it's away from the radiator, it's shielded by the pipe. It doesn't get skewed readings. But the wiring is very simple. So you can see there's 2 wires here. There's black and orange. It doesn't matter which one is which. There's no polarity to it. It's just whatever it is. So one wire has to go to ground, so I would recommend using the black wire, unless you're like a little masochist, but black wire to ground, and all you can do there is run just like a wire to a bolt somewhere on the frame rail or wherever you want, and then the other wire is what has to go back to the ECU. So what I do typically if I'm running these is there's the single wire that runs across and goes to the top of the power steering pump, which we obviously don't have power steering, so his wire is probably somewhere in that mess. What you can do, because you don't need that wire anymore, it doesn't do anything on a standalone. You can cut the wire, run that open end to, in this case, the orange pin, or the orange wire. And then what you're doing is that already goes through to the ECU. And what we will do on the ECU side, which I'll show you when we do the ECU install in the next episode, is you can cut the wire at the ECU and then run it into the options port. So you're not using that pin on the ECU or anything like that. You're just using the carcass of the wire to transport the signal back in. So that's my recommendation. Just cut it, pin it into this harness, and then worry about that once we go to do the ECU install. Makes this very easy. No like extra running of wires through the firewall or anything like that. And I'll show you guys when we do the install what that looks like, because I'm not going to use it obviously, but I'll show you which wire it is at the ECU so that when you're doing it you can do the same thing. Okay, now I think we're caught up. I really have to pay more attention to what buttons I hit on this little camera. Now we're caught up though, and we have 4 more connectors to install. So it's very easy at this point. His is going to be a little harder because he's already done some variable throttle position sensor stuff that I'm going to undo just to make it a little cleaner. But we have to run the cam sensor, crank sensor, throttle position sensor, and idle air control valve. So if you're doing the swap like I suggest, you have an NB throttle position sensor. You can get them off Rock Auto. You have an NB idle air control valve. You can also get them off Rock Auto. They're like 120 bucks. Just make sure you get the NB throttle body because the adapter plates on the bottom are different. So if you get the 64 mil throttle body from eBay, like I recommend, just get the one that is 99 to 05, and then it'll come with the right adapter plate and it'll all bolt together. So let's start with the cam and crank sensor. So here's the cam sensor on a VVT. On a 99 to 2000, it's up here, non-VVT. And then here is the crank position sensor. So it's that guy down there, and the wire runs up here. Make sure you run it away from your belts and all that. Each of those, if you're a keen viewer, has 3 pins. This is the old CAS plug, cam angle sensor that is on the back of the heads. This has 4 pins. 4 does not equal 6 that we need. So all it is, it's very simple. There's power, ground, cam position, and crank position all in here. And what we're gonna do is split the power and split the ground. This gets power ground cam, that gets power ground crank. So there's no running wires or anything like that. We're gonna make a little harness. I'm gonna cut this off and put a connector here because I'm just extra like that. And then we'll run from that connector as like a jumper harness. We'll just run 3 wires to that guy, and we'll run 3 wires to that guy. You can get all these plugs on Bollinger Motorsports. I will try to remember to put the links to all of them down below, but I highly recommend just getting the whole crimp together set. It makes it way cleaner, less failure points. So I'm gonna start by cutting this off right there. We're gonna lop that off. I'll peel the electrical tape back, and then I will show you guys what each wire is and where each wire has to go. All right, so I stripped the harness back, and you have white with a red stripe, which is your power. You have black with a green stripe, which is your ground. So that will need 2 of each. You have yellow with a blue stripe. That is your cam position sensor. And then you have just solid white over here, which is in pin 4. That is your crank. So I just popped them into a Deutsch connector. As you know, I love me some Deutsch connectors. I'm just gonna put those away. And now I'm gonna make a plug out of the other side where I'll run them all out, and then I will splice off the power and I'll splice off the ground, and then the cam sensor will go there and crank sensor will go over there. So not complicated, just gotta take a little bit of time. Again, the VVT swap mega thread is a lifesaver. So I'm gonna grab, I have plugs for these, and I have plugs for those. Again, I'll put them all down below in the description with links and all that so you guys can buy them yourself. Cleanest way to do it. So I'm gonna start with that. I'll show you guys before I loom it up what the harness looks like. I'll walk you through it, it'll make sense, and then we'll move on to throttle and idle air control. All right, more spaghetti. So here's where we're at. You can see I split the 12 volts. I've split the grounds. So now I have 12 volt white, which is the same as the chassis color, black. Runs over to the harness here, and if you can see from the top, blue is the signal wire on the aftermarket one. So we got red, blue to white, black to black. So this is crank position. Up here, we have die Deutsche Farbe. We have the German colors of red is the leftmost pin on here. Signal, again, is yellow is center. And then black is the rightmost plug. So I had to dig around pretty hard for that info when I did this the first time. So now you guys know it. Power, signal, ground, left to right. So what I'm going to do is unplug this, take this over to the bench, I'll heat shrink those down, and I will loom the whole thing up, plug it in, and then we will have cam and crank signal. Loomed up. Looks factory-ish. I will be throwing a zip tie around this just so that this doesn't like fall into the belt. But there you have it. And then the last thing that we're gonna wire in is TPS and idle air control. So these are NB throttle position sensors and idle air control valve. Well, this is an NB throttle position sensor and this is an NB idle air control valve. So you can see I have these blank plugs with no anything in them. And then we have 5 wires. So to save you guys the headache, I cut off his old stuff because he had a BMW TPS and it was all taped up weird. So I stripped it back to the bare harness. If you cut your throttle position sensor off, you'll be left with green with white, black with green, and red. And then if you cut your idle air control off, you'll be left with blue and then white with red. So keep them separate. And what we're gonna do is very simple. This is why I like the NB throttle position sensor. It goes red, black, and then green. And so I'll obviously pin those in there, but that is the wiring for the throttle position sensor. And then I don't think it matters, but the way I did it on the last car that it worked was for idle air control, I had blue on the top and then white with red on the bottom. So like that. So that was how I pinned it and it worked mint. So I'm gonna pin those up, loom this up, plug those in, and the VVT will be wired into the car. There you have it, just as discussed. Green, black, red, blue, white. So that's all plugged in, it's all happy. If you use these connectors, make sure you push in the locking tabs. Oh, that one is yellow, just push it in when you're done. Keeps the wires in place. And just like that, I mean I got stuff all over the place, but the car is wired. So obviously we have to do some ECU stuff, but we will do that in the next episode because I want to release this so that you guys, I got a bunch of you that said you were in the middle of a swap. So I want to get this out for you guys and then you can do the chassis side and then I'll go over in detail how to wire it into an ECU. This is going to be beer money, but the process is the same for a Mega Squirt. So just pay attention and then read the manuals and you'll figure it out pretty easy. So I actually already filmed an outro and then I realized I never did the fuel stuff. So I'm going to go over the fuel system with you. There's 2 options in my book, or in my opinion. There's the one that is in the VVT swap forum, and then there's the one that I use. I'm sure there's other ways you can do this, but I'm going to go over the way I do it quickly. It's more expensive, but it is easier and it looks cleaner, and then I'll cover how to do the other method once we're done. So let's get to it. So we have a radium fuel rail. This rail works for both NA and NB, that's why there's 2 sets of holes. NB, use the lower hole. And then we have a barb here, and then we actually just have a 6AN right here. What I'm going to do is put a 6AN to 5/16 barb adapter on that, so that'll just screw on the end. And then all we're going to have to do is run one line to that, and then the other line to the front port. The routing is important because you actually want feed from the tank pre-regulator. So you want it to come, this line, by the way, the rear line is the feed, the front line is the return. So we're gonna go feed into this barb here to the rail. That way the rail always has undisturbed fuel. And then through the pressure regulator, and then this is the return. And if you look on the bottom of these, I can't show you just because it's like tucked up in there, but there's writing down there. This is the return to the fuel system, fuel tank. So we're gonna run return out of here into this upper port or the front port. So it's very simple. It is 5/16 here, and these are 5/16 if you get the kit from Radium. Super, super simple. So I'm gonna run those lines, I'll show you what it looks like. You want either hose clamps or spring clamps on it because it's pressurized. As simple as that. I bent the lines down just so they're a little low profile. They don't need to be all the way up here anymore. So lower one, or the rear one still, is the feed, and I have it running around. It's kind of weird. Around, and then it loops back up. If you try, you can bend this the other way, and you can just run it that way. I'm always afraid that it's going to kink or crack the line, so I try not to do that. I will be tucking it down a little more so it's not like stressing anything, but that's there. And then the return is just the front. It's just the front port, and then it runs up to here into a 5/16 to 6AN adapter, which bolts up to the rail perfectly. So because I know this question always gets asked or is like never really listed, these are 14 millimeter clamps. So 14 millimeter spring clamps, they fit perfectly. I just have like a big assorted box over there. But if you're not trying to buy them in bulk, 14 millimeter clamps work perfectly on 5/16 hose. This is radium supplied fuel hose. If you're not using the radium kit, make sure you get fuel rated hose. You can get it from like AutoZone or wherever. It's really cheap. Just get a couple feet of it. Like I had a little bit of extra. This is just what comes with it. There you go. So radium 5/16, fuel rated. If you use like cheap vacuum hose or cheap rubber hose, it will disintegrate. It will put rubber material into your fuel system and it will wreak havoc on everything. So don't skimp out on the couple dollars it'll save you. So get some fuel rated hose. Now let's get into if you're not going to use the radium kit. So you don't want to use the radium rail because it's too expensive or whatever your reasons are. If you want to use an OEM combination, you have to use a 99 to 2000 fuel rail. And then you have to take the fuel pressure regulator, which is that little thing that looks like a top hat with 2 bolts. Remove that from the old 90 to 93 fuel rail. Bolt that into the 99 fuel rail with the barb pointing straight up, and you want to straighten the barb out. And then I believe it comes out like right here. And then the routing is the same. So you want feed in, so rear line into the rail. And then the return comes out of the regulator. So that's it. It bolts up. It's a little tight, a little tricky, a little weird, but it does work. And it is way more cost effective than doing this setup. I just like this for simplicity, and I think it looks sleek. So, choose your battles. So on the rear, you'll always have a port here for the brake booster. So that'll just go right there. This guy I'm gonna cap. I just have it as an option. This port is capped as well. And since this car is turbo, I'm going to need blow-off valve. We're going to need the map sensor from the ECU. And we're going to need fuel pressure regulator. So if you're NA, you'll only need fuel pressure, which is a little reference line. And then you'll need the map line to the ECU. So he already had his run. He literally run a vacuum hose through the firewall. And then that plugs into the ECU, which I'll cover when we get to the ECU install. But run a 8mm vacuum hose through the firewall. And then the fuel pressure regulator, there's a spot on the back here. I don't have it installed yet, but there will be a bung that goes right here. And that will run to one of these, and so will this. And what I'll do is I'll end up teeing it off so I can get 2 supplies into one. I will do a direct feed for the map, and then I will share fuel pressure regulator with the blow-off valve. So this will be my reference line to the ECU, and this will be fuel and blow-off valve. Now, if you have anything like cruise control or whatever else, on the last build I did, I put a Motion Raceworks vacuum manifold right here, and it was super nice because I could run the brake line into it, I could run the map line into it, and then I could plug all these ports and just run one dedicated 3/8 line up to that. So that got vacuum, and you had all sorts of outputs for whatever you want. But simplest terms, NA VVT swap, map line, fuel pressure regulator, brake booster, and that's it. Everything else you don't really need to worry about. That covers fuel, vacuum lines, wiring, and all the external stuff you need to bolt on, like alternator and whatnot. So this video may have complicated it more than it was worth, but we've got 3 lines to the ECU, injector 3, 4, and VVT. You have the map line to the ECU, and then you have to convert your CAS plug into both cam angle and crank angle sensor, and then you have to wire in your TPS and your idle air control valve. I will chapterize this video so you can go back and find like CAS wiring, crank wiring, all that stuff, just to make it a little easier for you guys. And obviously if you have any questions, I would first reference the VVT Mega Swap thread, and if you can't figure your question out, shoot me a DM on Instagram. It's at Napp Motorsports. I look at every message that I get, so I can hopefully help answer your question. It is not that complicated. Just take your time, work your way through it. Make sure you have the right stuff like wires and crimps and stuff like that. I went over the top with the Deutsch connectors, but it's like the right way to do it. So that's how I did it. You can crimp it together. You can use spade connectors. You can get Amazon plugs, whatever you want. In the next episode, when I have the ECU, I will show you running options port stuff, how to set up the ECU, how to do the VVT setup in Tuner Studio. It'll be for Beer Money Motorsports, but it's very similar for Mega Squirt, so follow along. If you're uneasy about anything on that side of things, I'm going to suggest you go talk to a tuner. I'm not a tuner. I get help every time I set it up, so you should do the same. But we will cover how to get this thing up and running in the next episode once the ECU is here. I'm going to do some fab work while I wait for that, and I'm going to like run the grounds and some other stuff that has to be done. And then once the ECU shows up, I'll pick you guys back up. So I'm going to shut up because I've been talking forever. Thank you guys for watching. If you like this, like it, comment, subscribe. Let me know what else you guys want to see, and I'll try to accommodate that. I'm going to try to pick up YouTube a little more because it is important. It's just a trade-off for me between like working on cars and filming stuff. So I got to find a bit of a balance. But I will see you guys in the next one, and thank you for watching.